Mr. President, thank you. On February 22nd, 2022, you addressed your country in a nationwide address when the conflict in Ukraine started. And you said that you were acting because you had come to the conclusion that the United States, through NATO, might initiate a, quote, surprise attack on our country. And to American ears, that sounds paranoid. Tell us why you believe the United States might strike Russia out of the blue. How did you conclude that?
Well, it was not about that the United States wanted to surprisingly strike Russia. I didn't say so. Is it a talk show or is it a formidable, serious talk that we're having?
Here's the quote. Thank you. It's a formidable, serious talk.
It's a serious talk, okay. You are trained in history, as far as I know.
Yes.
So I'll allow myself to spend a minute to give you a reference note, a debriefing, if you don't mind that.
Please.
Well, look, our relationship with Ukraine, what was the starting point of the relationship? Where does Ukraine come from? The Russian state became centralized, which was the year of establishment of the Russian state in 862, when, well, there is a city of Novgorod in the northwest of Russia, when they invited Prince Rurik from Scandinavia, from the Vikings, in 862. In 1862, 1,000 years since the establishment of the statehood was marked, and there is a memorial dedicated to that in Novgorod. In 882, the successor of Rurik, Prince Oleg, who actually was a regent to Rurik's young son, came to Kiev. He ousted two brothers that used to be in the past, had been in the past members of the crew of Rurik. And so there were two centers of the statehood, in Kiev and in Novgorod, back then. The next red letter date was 888, the conversion into Christianity, when Prince Vladimir accepted Eastern Christianity, the Orthodox faith, in Kiev. Since then, decentralized power in Russia got entrenched with a single territory, a single economy, one and the same language, and after the baptism of Rus, they had the same faith and the rule of Grand Prince, and the centralized Russian state was fledgling. Thanks to different reasons, after the succession to throne practices were introduced by Yaroslav the Wise. After he passed away, there was not direct order of succession from father to the eldest son, but it was the horizontal from the demised prince to his brother, and all that led to the partitioning. Feudal partitioning of ancient Rus. Same happened in Europe. It was a natural process, but that partitioned state, Russian state, became and fell prey to the empire established by Genghis Khan, and Khan party came to Rus, pillaged all the cities, and different cities like Kiev and others lost their independence, while northern cities of Russia preserved part of their sovereignty. They paid tribute to the yoke. And later, the centralized Russian state became fledgling in northwestern part of Russia, and the southern lands of Russia were gravitating towards another center, the one of Europe, the Grand Lithuanian Dukedom, Duchy, the Lithuanian-Russian Duchy, as the ethnic Russians constituted a big part, and they were Orthodox in faith and they spoke the ancient Russian language then there, but later Poland, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania were unified, and another unification in spiritual sphere was signed, and part of the Orthodox priests were now subordinate to Pope. So those lands were transferred to the Polish and Lithuanian state, but for decades the Poles tried to convert those people, those Russians, trying to entrench an idea that those were not specifically and fully Russian, trying to assimilate them. Ukraine means the trim of the nation, the trim of the land, the border area. So some of them were border guards or something, but there was not about a specific ethnic group. So the Poles tried to assimilate the Russian population there and treated those lands in a tough or cruel even way. All that led to that part of the Russian lands struggle for their rights. They wrote letters to Warsaw claiming that their rights were to be upheld.
I beg your pardon, can you tell us what period? I'm losing track of where in history we are. The Polish oppression of Ukraine.
It was in the 13th century, 13th century, 14th century. 13th century. And I'll tell you what happened later, and I'll keep track of the dates. In 1654, or a bit earlier, the people who controlled power in that part of the Russian lands addressed Warsaw, claiming that some Russian ethnicity and Orthodox rulers would be sent to govern them, and Warsaw declined and rejected that, and then they turned to Moscow, so that Moscow would establish its power over them. I'm not inventing things, don't you think? Just. I'll give you these documents.
It doesn't sound like you're inventing it. I'm not sure why it's relevant to what happened 2 years ago.
Well, still, these are copies from the archive with letters from Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the one who controlled that part of the Russian lands that is now called Ukraine, and he wrote to Warsaw claiming that the rights be upheld, and when he was rejected, he received a refusal, he started writing to the Tsar of Moscow, wishing to be part of the Russian lands. And there is a translation in Russian and in English probably. Russia would not accept them straight away because they feared that a war with Poland would be unleashed. 1654, the Zemsky Council decided that this part of the ancient Russian lands be accepted as part of the new Russian land. And the war with Poland began, and it lasted for 13 years, and afterwards a truce was enacted after the 1654 Act. 32 years afterwards, the eternal peace with Poland was established and proclaimed. And all the left bank of the Dniester River, including Kiev, Dnieper River, was part of Russia, became part of Russia, and the right bank of Dnieper became part of Poland. And under the rule of Catherine the Great, Russia returned all those historical lands of its. And that all happened and lasted till the revolution. But before World War I, using the ideas of Ukraine ethnicity and origin, the Austrian General Staff started promoting the Ukrainian origin and Ukrainian identity, because they, in the view of the First World War, they wanted to weaken the prospective enemy. And the idea that had been born in Poland, that those people residing in that territory were not specifically and wholly Russian, was later promoted by the Austrian General Staff, and theorists appeared in the 19th century upholding the independence of Ukraine. They spoke of its need to obtain independence, but all the pillars of the Ukrainian sovereignty, all the proponents, said that Ukraine was to have a very good relationship with Russia. They insisted on that. Well, after the revolution of the 1917 happened, Bolsheviks tried to restore the statehood, and the civil war began, including standoff with Poland. In 1921, the peace treaty with Poland was proclaimed, and under this treaty, the right bank of Dnieper River once again belonged to Poland. In 1939, after Poland cooperated with Hitler, and they collaborated with Hitler actually. We have all the documents in the archive, and Hitler proposed Poland a peace treaty and a friendship treaty, but he claimed that Poland should give the Danzig corridor back to Germany, and that connected the main part of Germany with East Prussia and Königsberg. And after the First World War, that part of territory was transferred to Poland, and instead of Danzig, the city of Gdansk appeared. It was renamed. So Hitler asked them to give it amicably. They refused, but still they collaborated with Hitler, and they together partitioned Czechoslovakia.
You're making a case that Ukraine, certainly parts of Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, is in effect Russia has been for hundreds of years. Why wouldn't you just take it when you became president 24 years ago? You have nuclear weapons, they don't. If it's actually your land, why did you wait so long?
I'll tell you. I'm coming to that. This debriefing is coming to an end. It might be boring, but it explains many things.
How it's relevant.
Good. I'm so gratified that you appreciate that. So after, before World War II, Poland did not accept the claims of Hitler, the demands of Hitler, but participated in partitioning of Czechoslovakia, but it did not give the Danzig corridor to Germany. The Poles played too much, and as a result of that, Hitler started the war with them, against them. On the 1st of September 1939, Poland turned uncompromising, and Hitler had to begin with Poland. And the USSR, I have read some archives, the USSR behaved in an honest way. The USSR asked Poland's permission to transit their troops through the Polish soil to help Czechoslovakia, but the then Polish foreign minister said that even if Soviet planes would fly over Poland, they would be downed, he said. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that the war began, and Poland fell prey to their own policies against Czechoslovakia. According to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, part of that territory now belongs to Russia, including Western Ukraine. And Russia, that was then named the USSR, came back to its historical lands. And after the victory in the Great Patriotic War, as we call World War II, all those territories were enshrined to belong to the USSR, finally and definitively. And actually, Poland, as a compensation, received the originally German Western lands, the eastern part of Germany, part of the eastern part of Germany, some segments. These are now western lands of Poland, and it once again received the part of the coastline of the Baltic Sea, and the Danzig once again was renamed to become Gdansk. So this is how the whole situation happened, and when the USSR was established in 1922, the Bolsheviks started establishing the USSR, and they established the Soviet Ukrainian Republic that was not existent before, hadn't existed before. And Stalin insisted that those republics would become autonomous entities. Unfortunately, strangely, Lenin insisted that they should have a right to withdraw and pull out of the USSR. And to unknown reasons, he transferred some of the lands to that Soviet Republic of Ukraine that belonged previously to Russia, and that became part of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, including the Black Sea region that was conquered by Catherine the Great, and it had no historical bearing on Ukraine, had no relations. In 1654, when Ukraine got reunified with Russia, they were the size of 3 to 4 contemporary regions of Ukraine.
In 1654. You obviously have encyclopedic knowledge of this region, but why didn't you make this case for the first 22 years as president that Ukraine wasn't a real country?
Yes, the Soviet Ukraine received a great deal of territory that had never belonged to it, including the Black Sea region. Russia received those lands as an outcome of the Russian-Turkish wars, and they were called New Russia or Novorossiya. But that doesn't matter. But actually Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, gave Ukraine its own territory, and for decades the Ukrainian Soviet Republic was part of the USSR. And to unknown reasons, the Bolsheviks promoted the Ukrainian culture and language. Ukrainization was called, and similar things were done in other Soviet republics. The ethnic profiles of those republics were raised and promoted. This is how Soviet Ukraine was created, and after the Second World War, Ukraine received part of the lands that had belonged to Poland before, and part of the land that had belonged to Hungary and Romania before. So Romania and Hungary were deprived of part of their lands, and these lands were snatched and given to Ukraine, and now they're still part of Ukraine. So in this sense, Ukraine is an artificial state that was established.
Hungary has a right to take its land back from Ukraine, and that other nations have a right to go back to their 1654 borders?
Well, I'm not sure whether they should come back to the 1654, but if anyone believes, and everyone believes, that the Stalin regime rule saw a lot of violations of human rights and violation of the rights of other nations. In this sense, actually, one can state that they may have a right to claim those lands back.
Have you told Viktor Orban that he can have part of Ukraine?
Никогда не говорил.
Never. I've never told him. I've never told him. Not a single time. Never. We haven't even had any conversation on that. But I actually know for sure.
Of course, the Hungarians who live over there, they want to get back to their historical land. Moreover, just an interesting anecdote, a personal one I would like to share with you. Let me divert a little bit. Somewhere in the 80s, I think I went on a road trip through the USSR from Leningrad on a car via Kiev, then I went to western Ukraine. I went to the town of Beregovoye, and all the names of the cities and towns over there are were in Russian, and also in one language I didn't understand. It was Hungarian, it was not Ukrainian. So I went through a village, and there were men sitting next to their houses, and they were wearing black suits, three-piece suits, and then in cylinder hats. And I was wondering whether those were artists. And I was told these were Hungarians. And I asked, what are they doing here? And they say that's their historical land. They live here. It was during the Soviet times, the 1980s, and they had managed to preserve the Hungarian language, Hungarian names, national attire, and they felt Hungarian, and they were Hungarian.
So that is, and there's a lot of that, though. I think many nations that are upset about Transylvania as well, as you obviously know. But many nations feel frustrated by the redrawn borders of the wars of the 20th century. And wars going back 1,000 years, the ones that you mentioned. But the fact is that you didn't make this case in public until 2 years ago, February. And in the case that you made, which I read today, you explain at great length that you felt a physical threat from the West in NATO, including potentially a nuclear threat, and that's what got you to move. Is that a fair characterization of what you said?
Я понимаю, что поскольку мои длинные диалоги, они,
yes, I understand that probably a long soliloquy does not fit the genre of an interview. So I asked whether that was a show or a serious talk, and you said it was a serious talk. So bear with me, please. So we are coming to the point where the Soviet Ukraine was established. Then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and everything that Ukraine had got as a gift from Russia, well, it took with it. And generally, I'm coming to the current point in time. The collapse of the Soviet Union was basically the initiative of the Russian leadership. I do not understand what they were thinking back then, but I suspect that there were several elements to their rationale, several reasons. First, I believe that the then Russian leadership thought that the fundamental basic relations between Russia and Ukraine, such as common language, because 90% back then spoke Russian, familial ties, because 1 in 3 Russians have families or some other ties in Ukraine, common culture, common history, common religion. These are fundamentals, also being in one single state for hundreds of years. These are fundamentals, just as the economic interconnections. And that is what drove the Russian leadership to think that inevitably the relations would be good between the two countries. And secondly, as an American citizen, I want you and your audience to know that the Russian leadership thought that, okay, the USSR would cease to exist, but there would be no more divisive lines of ideological nature. They also thought that Russia, voluntarily, of its own volition, decided to dissolve the Soviet Union, thinking that the civilized West, as it were, would see that as an invitation to friendship and alliance. That is what Russia was expecting from the US and the collective West as a whole. There were some smart people, in particular in Germany, Egon Barth. He was a prominent politician from the Social Democratic Party, and in personal talks with the Soviet leadership before the collapse of the Soviet Union, he was insisting that a new collective security system should be established in Europe. Yes, he thought that help should be given to the reunified Germany, but also it was supposed to create a security system involving the US, Canada, and he said if NATO would expand, then it would be back during the Cold War, but only closer to Russia's border. He was very smart, but no one listened to him. And we've got some talks from archives, and he got angry. He said, if you don't listen to us, I am never setting my foot in Moscow once again. He was very frustrated with the Soviet Union, and his prophecy came true.
Well, of course, it did come true, and you've mentioned this many times. I think it's a fair point, and many in America thought that relations between Russia and the United States would be fine with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, that the opposite happened. But you've never explained why you think that happened, except to say that the West fears a strong Russia, but we have a strong China the West does not seem very afraid of. What about Russia do you think convinced policymakers they had to take it down?
The West is afraid of a strong China more than it fears a strong Russia, because it's just 150 million people in Russia and it's 1.5 billion people in China, and also China's economy is growing at more than 5% a year. So the potential is enormous. Bismarck used to say the most important thing is the potential, and China potentially is the biggest economy in the world in terms of purchasing parity. It's outstripped the US. But let's not talk about who is afraid of whom. Let's not talk in such terms. Let's get back to the fact that after 1991, when Russia expected that it would be inducted into the brotherly nation of civilized nations, it didn't happen. Well, you tricked us. Well, I'm not talking about you personally. I'm talking about the US. We were promised that NATO would not expand eastwards, but there were 5 waves of expansion. And we bore with that, we tolerated that, we were trying to reason with them, because we were saying, we are like you right now, we are, a capitalist economy, let's come to terms, let's find an agreement, let's look at Yeltsin times. There was a moment when, the grey cat crossed our path, as it were. Yeltsin came to the US, he spoke in Congress, he said the good words, and these were the signals. These were the signals telling you, let us in. But then, remember the developments in Yugoslavia. Before that, Yeltsin was lavished with praise, but then he raised his voice in support of Serbs, and we couldn't but do that. Yes, I understand there were some complex processes underway, but Russia couldn't help raising its voice in support of Serbia, because Serbia is a brotherly nation, also an Orthodox culture. So Yeltsin spoke in favor of Serbia, but what did the US do? In violation of international law and the UN Charter, they started bombing Belgrade and the US, and it was the US that let the gin out of the bottle. Moreover, when Russia was indignant, when it was protesting, it was told that the international law and the UN Charter had become obsolete. Right now they are all referring to international law, but back then they were saying that the international law was obsolete. Yes, some things need to be changed, but not in this manner. And then Yeltsin came under heavy criticism. He was accused of alcoholism, of understanding nothing. He understood everything. Okay, I became president in 2000, and I thought, okay, Yugoslavia is a thing of the past. Let's give a shot at rebuilding the relations. Let's reopen the door that Russia had tried to go through. Moreover, I said that publicly, and I can reiterate, there was a meeting here in the Kremlin with the outgoing President of the U.S., Bill Clinton. We sat in the room next door, and I told him, Bill, what do you think? If Russia asked to be admitted into NATO, do you think it would happen? He said, it's interesting. I think yes. But in the evening, when we had another meeting for dinner, he said, I've talked to my team, no. Not going to happen, not now. So you can ask him. I think he'll watch this interview. I wouldn't have said anything like that if it hadn't happened.
Were you sincere? Would you have joined NATO?
Listen, I asked a question. I said, is it possible? And the answer was no.
But if he had said yes, would you have joined NATO?
If
he'd said yes, then the process of rapprochement would have commenced, and it might have happened in the end if there were some sincere wish on this side of our partners, but it didn't happen. Okay.
Why do you think that is? Just to get to motive. I know you're clearly bitter about it. I understand. But why do you think the West rebuffed you then? Why the hostility? Why did the end of the Cold War not fix the relationship? What motivates this from your point of view?
Вы сказали, что я испытываю горечь.
You said that I feel bitter because of that rebuffal. No, that's not bitterness. I'm just stating the facts. Because, we're not bride and groom. These are not the terms we've got to use in speaking about such matters. We understood that they were not expecting us there. Okay, we said, let's build relations in another manner. Let's look for common ground elsewhere. Why we got that negative response, you should ask your government. I could only guess. We would be too big of a country with its own opinion. Well, I saw how NATO solves and settles matters. Just an example I would like to cite. It applies to Ukraine. The U.S. says something and all the rest just tune in and they follow and they wake. I'm not going to open any secret to you or say anything new, but, after that conversation, we made different attempts at building relations. Just to cite an example, during the events in the Middle East and Iraq, we were building our relations with the U.S. in a very prudent, cautious manner. And I always asked the U.S. not to support separatism in the Northern Caucasus, but they still continued with that financial information support, even military support. And that support was flowing in from the U.S. and from its satellites, support towards terrorist bands in the Northern Caucasus. I once talked to a colleague of mine, a president of the U.S., and I raised that issue, and he said, it's impossible. He said, do you have proof? And I said, yes, I have proof, and I gave that proof to him. And do you know what his response would be? He said, I would give him a good thrashing. That's what he said. Kick their ass, he said. And we were waiting for some response, reply, and I asked a colleague from FSB, to contact his counterpart in the U.S. And we've got the response, basically, from the CIA and the archives. And the response goes as follows. So, yes, we have worked with the opposition forces in Russia, and we think it is the right thing to do, and we will continue doing that. Just ridiculous. We understood that no serious conversation could be...
Forces in opposition to you. So you're saying the CIA is trying to overthrow your government?
Well, of course, in that particular case, what they meant were the separatists, the terrorists that were fighting us in the northern Caucasus. That is who they called the opposition. That's the second moment. Another aspect, also very important. I'm talking about the setting up of the US ABM system, the very beginning of that. We long tried to persuade them not to do that. I got an invitation from Bush Sr. He invited me to visit his place on the ocean, and we had a very serious conversation with President Bush, with his team. So I proposed the following. I said, the US, Russia, and Europe should set up a joint shared ABM system against the threats against our security. Even though, the official statement of the US was that the ABM system they were setting up was against Iran, the threat of Iran. So I suggested, why not join forces together, the US, Russia, and Europe? And I got a very interesting response. They asked me, are you serious?
Let me ask, what year was this?
Well, I don't remember. We can look it up on the internet when I was in the US at the invitation of Bush Sr. And it's easier to learn from someone I'm going to tell you about in a sec. And they told me, yes, that is a very interesting proposal. And so I said, just imagine if we can solve this strategic task together, the world would change. Yes, we would probably have differences, economic differences, political differences, but we would drastically change the situation in the world. And they asked me, are you serious? And I said, yes. They said, we need some time to think. And I said, okay, go ahead. And then, at this very room where we're talking, we got former CIA Director Gates and also State Secretary Rice. They sat here opposite from me at this table. We had Defense Minister, Foreign Minister, and the guests said, yes, we've thought about that, but we disagree.
And twice you've described U.S. presidents making decisions and then being undercut by their agency heads. So it sounds like you're describing a system that's not run by the people who are elected, in your telling.
Yes, exactly. So yes, they just rebuffed us. I'm not going to reveal all the details because that was a confidential conversation, but our proposal was declined. It's a fact. And I said, okay, listen, but in that case, we will have to come up with a response, and we'll have to come up with offensive systems that are capable of overcoming your ABM systems. And they said, your systems are not against you, and we'll assume that yours are not against us. And we had to come up with the hypersonic intercontinental missiles, and we continue to develop this technology, and we are ahead everyone in the world in terms of hypersonic offensive systems. And day in, day out, we are perfecting these systems. We proposed that another path should be followed, but our proposal was rejected. Now, as for the NATO expansion eastwards, they promised us that they wouldn't move an inch to the east, but it was not enshrined on paper. So there were 5 waves of expansion. And the Baltic states did join, and Eastern Europe in general. And now I'm coming to the crux of the matter. They came to Ukraine. In 2008, at the Bucharest summit, a statement was made saying that the doors were open to Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. Now, as far as decisions are made in NATO, Germany, France allegedly were against, some other countries, European countries. But, President Bush is a very tough guy. And as I was told afterward, I was told that he had exerted pressure on them and they had to acquiesce. So it's like in a kindergarten, where are the guarantees? Who are they? They got under some pressure and they had to agree. Okay, but then they say, Ukraine is never going to join NATO. And I say, I know that you agreed to open the doors to Ukraine in 2008. There is no guarantee that you're not going to do the same sometime in the future. So I don't know whom to talk to over there. We are willing to talk, but who to? Whether regarding the guarantees, no guarantees at all.
And they started entering the Ukrainian soil. This was the full history about how that territory developed and what relationship they had with Russia. Each second or third person there has had ties with Russia. So when the elections happened in the new sovereign Ukraine as a result of the Declaration of Independence of Ukraine that said that Ukraine was a neutral state, but all of a sudden in 2008 NATO doors were opened to that. So it's so interesting, but we hadn't agreed to that. We didn't come to terms on that. All presidents that rose to power in Ukraine relied on voters, on the electorate that had a good relationship and a good attitude to Russia. The southeast of Ukraine had always had a good attitude to Russia. And, it was very difficult to dissuade this electorate. And Mr. Yanukovych rose to power afterwards there. He won the election after Kuchma, and the rerun was organized. That was not enshrined in Ukrainian constitution. This was a coup, actually, a coup d'etat. Just imagine someone in the United States wouldn't like the outcome. No. Prior to that, before, so after President Kuchma retired, Yanukovych won the election, but his opponents did not acknowledge his victory, and the United States backed the opposition, and a rerun was held, which actually was virtually a coup d'etat, and the United States backed that. And as a result of this rerun, like fancy someone doesn't like the outcome of the American election and a rerun happens that is not enshrined in the American Constitution. So Viktor Yushchenko rose to power in Ukraine. He was a pro-Western politician. Well, anyway, we established some working contacts with him. He came to visit us and we went to Kiev. We had meetings informally also. Well, let them be pro-Western, okay? Let them do what they want. They should have their own domestic developments independently. After he ruled that country, things deteriorated there. And as a result, Yanukovych once again came to power. He may not have been the best president. I'm not sure. I would like to give any assessments. But the matter of the association with the EU was brought up. We always were quite loyal on that. Okay, but when we read the draft agreement, it turned to be a problem for us because us and Ukraine had a free trade area, an open customs borders, and Ukraine had, according to that association agreement, opened their borders to Europe, and that would flow to our market, duty-less. And then we said we'll close our borders with Ukraine, our customs. And Yanukovych started doing his reckoning and counting whether Ukraine will lose or gain, and he stated to his Ukrainian counterparts that he had to think, and destructive opposition activity began straight away, and it ended up with Maidan, with a coup d'etat in Ukraine. So he did more
trade with Russia than with the EU? Ukraine did?
Yes, of course. It's not about the volumes of trade, the quantities. It's about the cooperation ties that the Ukrainian economy relied upon. And those cooperation ties between enterprises and factories had been there since the Soviet times, like an enterprise would produce components for final assembly, both plants in Ukraine and Russia, and there was very close cooperation, but a coup d'etat happened afterwards. It was perpetrated, unfortunately. Well, I wouldn't like to speak of details, but the United States said, you calm Yanukovych down and you would mollify the opposition. They said, let it drift. They said, towards a political settlement. We said, okay, we are in agreement with that, let it be so. And Yanukovych checked to apply for armed forces or police, while the armed opposition in Kiev perpetrated a coup d'etat. How can I reckon that and assess that? Who are you, I asked the United States.
With the backing of whom?
With the backing of CIA. Definitely, this is an entity that you wanted to become part of. Thanks goodness you were not accepted. Although it's a serious entity. My ex-counterparts, I worked in the first office, main directorate of the Soviet intelligence service, and they were our opponents. But you know, this is work. Well, technically they did the right thing. They attained what they wanted, the outcomes they wanted. They changed the power in Ukraine, but politically it was a blunder, a colossal blunder, and the political leadership probably should have calculated otherwise, and they were to have thought what it would lead to. In 2008, they opened doors of NATO to Ukraine. In 2014, a coup d'etat was perpetrated with their help, and this was a coup d'etat, and those who did not recognize this coup d'etat were persecuted, and they created a threat to Crimea and had to take Crimea under our protectorate. They began warfare in Donbass, applying artillery and aviation against civilians in Donbass. We have the footages with fighter jets bombing Donetsk, flying over that, and they had a major military operation. They failed and had another one and another one. Against the backdrop of military development of that territory of NATO and open doors of NATO. So we actually had to express our concerns, otherwise it would be negligence, criminal negligence on our part. It would have been criminal negligence, because the American leadership, political leadership, drove us to the borderline that we could not overstep, and that would destroy Russia, and we had to support our creed mates, our faith mates.
What was but that was 8 years before the current conflict started. So what was the trigger for you? What was the moment where you decided you had to do this?
Well, the trigger originally, the trigger was the coup d'etat in Ukraine, and representatives of 3 European nations came then, Germany, Poland and France, and they acted as guarantors of the agreement subscribed between Yanukovych and the opposition, and they put their signatures as guarantors. Despite that, the opposition perpetrated that coup, and these countries pretended they were not the guarantors. They were oblivious, and they threw it to the dustbin. And I'm not sure whether there is any knowledge in the United States about the guarantors and this agreement between opposition and the Yanukovych government. And instead of a political settlement, they supported the coup, they backed the coup. There was no point in that, actually, believe me, because Yanukovych agreed to everything, and he was ready for early election, and he had no chance, he stood no chance to succeed, to win. Why then perpetrate this coup and all those victims? And why pose a threat to Crimea and launch an operation against Donbass? I cannot understand that. I cannot fancy. This is the miscalculation of theirs, and the CIA did its part, played its part. One of the deputies of Secretaries of State said that they spent around $5 billion on that. But why do that? Why have they done that? It could have been done legally, legitimately, and without the loss of Crimea for them. And we wouldn't stir a finger. We wouldn't have stirred a finger had there not happened the developments, the bloody developments on Maidan. We back then agreed that after the collapse of the USSR, the borders would be as agreed, as stated, but we never agreed to an expansion of NATO or that Ukraine would become part of NATO. We never conceded and accepted that there would be NATO military bases there without any talks with us. We kept begging for decades, don't do this, don't do that. This actually acted as a trigger to the recent development, and with respect to the recent development, the leadership of Ukraine stated they would not abide by the Minsk Accords that were signed after the developments of 2014 in Minsk, with a plan laid out for peaceful settlement in Donbass. And the today's Ukrainian leadership, their foreign minister and other officials and the president said they didn't like a thing about the Minsk package of measures, and they would not stick to them. And the former leaders of France and Germany said that around a year ago, said in public, worldwide, that they had signed that agreement, but they had not been going to execute, to fulfill that. You know, they pulled our leg.
Was there anyone for you to talk to? Did you call a U.S. President, Secretary of State, and say, if you keep militarizing Ukraine with NATO forces, this is going to be we're going to act?
We kept telling them that. We kept telling them that. We addressed the American leadership and the European leaders, claiming that it be stopped immediately and the Minsk Accords were to be executed. It was our requirement, our demand. I was ready to fulfill, to honor. This is not an easy thing for Ukraine, with lots of autonomy for Donbass. But I was positive. It was my sincere belief that if we would persuade those people living in Donbass to come back to the Ukrainian statehood, and they had to be persuaded, the wounds would heal, I was sure, and sooner or later, gradually, that part of the Ukrainian territory would fit back into the overall frame of reference of Ukraine, and pensions and allowances would be paid once again. But no one wanted that in Ukraine. They wanted to act with the help of military force only. And it ended up with this situation, and they stated in Ukraine we would not fulfill the package of measures, and they started the war back in 2014. And our goal, our aim is to stop this war. We didn't launch it back in 2014. We're now trying to stop that.
I mean, have you achieved your aims?
No, at this point of time we have not, because one of the goals is the denazification, to denazify Ukraine. I mean, the prohibition of neo-Nazi movements in Ukraine. This is one of the issues that we discussed, that was brought up during negotiations in Istanbul last year, at the outset of last year. Upon our initiative, it was concluded, as the Europeans told us, that the context had to be established and provided for the final definitive signature of documents. And my colleagues in France and Germany told me, just imagine how are they going to sign this at gunpoint? You should move your troops, pull your troops back from Kiev. As soon as we pulled our troops back from the Kiev region, all of a sudden, straight away, our Ukrainian counterparts, our negotiators, threw all the accords and wasted them into the dustbin, and they got ready for a long-standing standoff and opposition, military opposition, with the help of the United States. This is how things develop.
But what is, pardon my ignorance, what is denazification? What would that mean? What is it?
Well, I'm coming to that. It is a very important question, a pertinent. Denazification, after the start of its independence, after they obtained the independence, Ukraine started looking for its identity, and it could not invent anything better than putting ahead of anything else the false heroes that collaborated with Hitler. I have already said that in early 19th century, the theorists of a future prospective Ukrainian independence appeared. They assumed that an independent Ukraine was to have a good relationship with Russia. But in the course of the historical development, and those territories were part of Poland, Ukrainians were persecuted, and this identity was pressed upon, the crackdown upon, and that all remained in people's memory. And once World War II began, part of that far right or far nationalist elite began to collaborate with Hitler, thinking that Hitler would bring them freedom. And the German troops, the SS troops, did the filthiest part of the job to eliminate Poles and Jews, and they did it with the hands of the collaborators, of those collaborators, and that massacre of the Poles and the Jews, of Russians, happened as a result. It was led by Bandera, Shushkevich, and other characters well known. And those people are now presented as national heroes. And they kept telling everybody that, nationalism is existent in other countries. There are sprouts, definitely, but, they are trampled upon in many countries, but not in Ukraine. In Ukraine, they are converted in national heroes. They're turned in national heroes, and monuments are erected to them. They are put on banners, and their names are chanted by the torch processions across the country. But those had annihilated, eliminated, exterminated Poles and Russians and Jews. And probably this glorification should come to an end. Any nation, I'm saying that they're part of Russian people. They're saying that we're a separate nation. If they believe to be a separate nation, they have a right to think so. Not, however, building upon the Nazi ideology. Like, look at the French president.
Would you be satisfied with the territory that you have now?
Let me conclude the previous thought. You asked me about neo-Nazism and denazification. So, like, the Ukrainian president came to visit Canada. It is well known, but it is hushed in the West, and they introduced a person to the Canadian Parliament, and that person, as the Speaker of the Canadian Parliament said, that this person waged warfare against Russians during World War II, And who were those who waged war against Russians? Hitler and his collaborators. And it turned out that he was part of the SS troops. He personally killed and slaughtered the Russians and the Poles. And the SS troops made out of Ukrainian nationalists did the dirty and filthy job. And the Ukrainian president rose together with the rest of Parliament of Canada. And he applauded this person. How can you imagine? How can you fancy that? And he is a Jew by ethnicity.
Really, my question is, what do you do about it? I mean, Hitler's been dead for 80 years. Nazi Germany no longer exists. And so, true. And so, I think what you're saying is you want to extinguish or at least control Ukrainian nationalism. But how? How do you do that?
Just listen to me. Your question is very intricate. May I speak up and say my true opinion? Will you not take offense?
Of course.
It is a tricky but a nasty question. You have been saying that Hitler is gone for 80 years, but actually his cause is with us, and the people that exterminated Jews, Poles and Russians are still alive, and a president, the current president of today's Ukraine, gives this person a round of applause in Canadian Parliament, a standing ovation. Can we say that we eradicated this ideology altogether if we see such manifestations today? This is what I mean to be denazification. We should get rid of these people that bring this practice and theory to life, trying to preserve that. This is what denazification is about.
Right. My question was a little more specific. It was, of course, not a defense of Nazis, neo or otherwise. It was a practical question. You don't control the entire country. You don't control Kiev. You don't seem like you want to. So how do you eliminate a culture or an ideology or feelings or a view of history in a country that you don't control? What do you do about that?
Well, you know, strange as it may seem to you, during the talks in Istanbul, we did come to an agreement. And, you know, everything was put on paper, saying, like statements that no Nazism, neo-Nazism would be cultivated in Ukraine, that it would be prohibited at the legislative level. So we did come to an agreement on this subject. And this can be achieved through talks. And there's nothing humiliating in that to Ukraine as a modern civilized state. Does any country have the right to propagate Nazism? No. That's it.